Hey everyone, this is Seniha. The article that I chose is titled Intraoperative Mapping and Monitoring of Sensory Vagal Fibers During Vagal Schwannoma Resection. So here's a quick overview of my presentation. First, I'll talk about the vagus nerve, vagal schwannoma, the methods used in this case report. Then we'll dive into the case report and discuss the results. I'll lastly end the presentation with the main takeaways, including my opinions on the publication and possible prospective studies. Now, as we already know, the 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve and is identified as a mixed cranial nerve, which means it has sensory, motor, and autonomic fibers. Its origin is in the brainstem, through the neck, and the thorax down to the abdomen. The vagus nerve is responsible for the regulation of internal organ functions such as digestion, heart rate, respiratory rate, as well as vasomotor activity and certain reflex actions such as coughing, sneezing, swallowing, vomiting. So here's a fun fact. As you can see in the figure on the right, the vagus nerve carries an extensive range of signals from the digestive system and organs to the brain and vice versa. Because of its long path through the human body, it's also been described as the wanderer nerve. So I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so here's an MRI T2 axial image of the vagus schwannoma that's presented in the 46-year-old patient that we'll talk about in the case report in a bit. Vagal schwannoma is also known as carotid space schwannoma, neuroma, or neurolemoma. It arises from the cervical vagus. It actually has a very rare and benign pathology, which usually gives unspecified symptoms and requires surgical excision. Some of the common symptoms of this tumor are visible lump, numbness, muscle weakness, pins and needles, and etc. But frequently, post-op complications can affect patients lifelong. Okay, so before I get into details, let me first define a couple acronyms that I'll be using throughout the presentation. IBSLN stands for Internal Branch of the Superior Laryngeal Nerve, LAR CIONM, Laryngeal Adductor Reflex Continuous Intraoperative Nerve Monitoring, CMAP, Compound Muscle Action Potential, ETT, Electromyographic Endotracheal Tube, R1 LAR, recording 1 laryngeal adductor reflex response. So I got this illustration from the article titled The Laryngeal Adductor Reflex is a New Methodology for Monitoring Thyroid Surgeries That May Predict Long-Term Outcome of Vocal Fold Function by Catherine Sinclair, who's the same author of this paper that we're analyzing today. The author defines laryngeal adductor reflex as a protective reflex that prevents aspiration by causing vocal fold closure, and then indicates that this method is a non-invasive tube-based methodology, as you can see in the figure on the left, that's been developed to monitor the recurrent laryngeal nerve, RLN, during thyroid surgeries, and can also be used to monitor the vagus nerve, which is our area of study in this case. The laryngeal adductor reflex is evoked using the ETT electrode stimulation of supraglottic mucosa, which is ipsilateral to the internal branch of the superior laryngeal nerve, which is at risk, right? And then it's recorded from the contralateral vocal fold, which is supplied by the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is not at risk. Now, ultimately, we see that this setup decreases the risk of coincident efferent pathway impairment. All right, so we're diving into the case itself. So this case report is on a 46-year-old female who has a progressively enlarging right vagal schwannoma at C1, C2 to C4, C5 levels, so the cervical vertebra, right? A preoperative laryngeal examination was done, which showed normal sensation with motion of right vocal fold. And then intraoperatively, we see that the schwannoma extended high into the neck. Then tumor mapping was performed with a bipolar probe to identify motor and sensory fibers, as you can see in the figure above. Figure 1 on the right shows that superiorly mapping elicited CMAP and R1 LAR responses, which indicates motor and sensory fiber activation. And then figure 2 on the right shows that inferiorly mapping elicited near supramaximal CMAP responses. Now, so figure 1 is superior and figure 2 is inferior. It's important to note that these were recorded with the EMG ETT, so the electromyographic endotracheal tube. So we see both sensory and motor fibers of the vagus nerve were identified on the surface of the tumor. And then after the schwannoma was removed using microsurgical techniques, again, during this process, the vagus nerve was continuously monitored using LAR, CIONM, and real-time information was gained, which is crucial. So here we see EMG ETT traces, the right vocal fold and the left vocal fold. Again, there was a continuous monitoring of the laryngeal adductor reflex of the vagal motor and sensory function using only an endotracheal tube. Again, that was a new method that they used. So they used ETT. All right, so here's a quote from the paper itself. I thought it pretty much summed up everything. Quote, in this case report of a high vagal nerve schwannoma, the LAR was utilized to identify, map, and monitor sensory and motor nerve fibers on the surface of the tumor prior to capsule incision and tumor inoculation. Close quote. So, the author also indicated that this is the first report of sensory vagus nerve monitoring during head and neck surgical procedures, which I think is amazing. And we also see that the patient had excellent functional outcomes. They've done a series of tests to ensure that there were no deficits. These included the barium swallow test, which showed no dysphagia or aspiration. They've also performed the fiber optic laryngoscopy, which showed a strong cough reflex and preservation of vocal fold mobility. All right, so here's a quick takeaway from this article. I tried to make it as clear as possible. Most of you probably have guessed it. This is from the questions on the rubric. So obviously I've already gone through all of these, or at least most of them, but it's just going to be a quick wrap. So the publication is about sensory vagus mapping and monitoring during vagal schwannoma resection. The authors presented a case report of a 46-year-old patient with vagal schwannoma and provided some details regarding the methods that they used and the post-op results that they have seen. Impact of publication. So they found out that mapping and monitoring vagus nerve sensory fibers is possible. And in fact, this was the first report that they had on sensory vagus nerve monitoring, which I thought was amazing. The information given was very helpful because it shows that this method has improved patient functional outcomes, and also continuous monitoring leads to real-time information about functional sensory nerve integrity, which is again very crucial, especially during high-risk surgeries, right? Analysis of the methodology. This article was a case study, which is a research approach that's used to generate a detailed understanding of a complex issue, but in a real-life context, which I thought was very helpful and made it a lot easier to understand, obviously with a real-life example. What else? Oh yeah, so were there any gaps or misleading conclusions? So I thought that they could have emphasized more on IONM technique. Someone who does not have an idea of IONM might be confused when reading this article. So maybe it would have been a little bit better if the authors elaborated more on IONM. All right. And lastly, students' conclusion. So my opinion on this, I thought that the flow of the paper was very clear, mostly. They did an excellent job. The transition between each section was very smooth. Maybe they could have had one or two more illustrations, but, it didn't hurt at all. Another thing about the flow that caught my attention was redundancy. The authors were a little repetitive towards the end of the paper, especially in the discussion and conclusion part. And lastly, prospective studies. So the authors had indicated that, sensory LAR mapping may also be very useful in brainstem surgeries. And also, the fact that this is the first paper that was published about, sensory LAR mapping. I think there is a long way to go, so they should have more studies, definitely. All right, so here are the references that I used. The first one is the article itself, and the other ones I used to get some images and also to have a clear understanding on some of the terms. All right, thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone else's presentations. Take care, everyone.